The logo you see comes up the right way for you, right?
Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and today my special guest is the editor-in-chief of Algemeiner, Dovid Efune. I hope I didn't ask ahead of time. Am I pronouncing the name right?
You're doing all right.
Okay, good. Dovid Efune, the Algemeiner, which is a very underrated online newspaper. By all means, it really has great stuff. I'm not only saying that because they republish a lot of my things, but it's really quality journalism and stories that you don't see anywhere else. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
Great.
Underrated by whom?
I'm sorry? Underrated by whom?
Underrated by whom?
You don't see enough of it. That's all I mean. You don't see it quoted enough places, and it should.
We're just getting started.
Okay, good. The main reason I wanted to talk to you is because, and this is just more my own frustration, and I saw you express the same frustration on Twitter, is like what's going on with anti-Semitism nowadays? This is like crazy stuff is happening, and there's like not much pushback. It's I mean, I'll go like backwards in order right now, but I mean, you can go actually in any order, but like this Nick Cannon thing was like insane, and it still hasn't hit the major media.
Look, first of all, what you're saying is exactly correct, especially when you talk about pushback in the context of what pushback looks like when sensitivities of other minorities are offended, right? We're living through pushback culture, if you will, and it seems a very notable exclusion in the Jewish community and anti-Semitism, and when we're dealing with anti-Semitism, especially, by the way, when it's a particular brand of anti-Semitism. When you talk about anti-Semitism all over the place in general, we've broken it down in some of our editorial discussions. Particularly one of our editors and writers, Benji Kirstein, wrote a seminal piece called Ilhan Omar and the Axis of Anti-Semitism, where he talks about the three pillars of anti-Semitism. So you've got your neo-Nazi anti-Semitism, which is pretty prevalent, right? That's the anti-Semitism of Charlottesville, but it's also anti-Semitism that legislates discussion of the Holocaust, that sort of obfuscates and downplays the Holocaust in Eastern Europe and plays up heroes and others that were involved in atrocities but are considered national figures. You know, we're seeing a decent amount of that. And of course, it's the anti-Semitism of Robert Bowers, who went and shot up that synagogue, the Tree of Life synagogue, tragically in Pennsylvania. Then you have the second pillar, which is Islamist anti-Semitism. Of course, that's the anti-Semitism of Hezbollah. There's the anti-Semitism of Hamas, the anti-Semitism of the killings, God forbid, at the Jewish school in Toulouse and the hyper-kosher supermarket, a lot of what we see in Europe. And then you have the third category, what we call intersectional anti-Semitism, which as of yet hasn't manifest in as deadly a fashion as the other types of anti-Semitism have. But it is an area that is of massive concern for a lot of people in the Jewish community, mainly because it contains within it the greater opportunity for the future of anti-Semitism to become a mainstream movement. And there's actually, the best place I saw this illustrated, I don't know if you've read, Bernard Henri Levy has a book he put out a few years ago called The Genius of Judaism. And in the first chapter, he talks about anti-Semitism. And one of the best lines in the whole book, he says, you know, people always ask me, is it possible to be anti-Israel without being anti-Semitic? So he says, I'll say the opposite is true. It's not possible to be anti-Semitic without being anti-Zionist. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are different types of anti-Semitism, but the future of anti-Semitism, the opportunity of anti-Semitism to morph and once again become a mainstream top-down ideology within this new iteration of the virus. And the best example of it actually becoming mainstream and close to a government level was what happened in England with Jeremy Corbyn. One election away of having a country run by an intersectional anti-Semite. Thankfully, there's a different situation today, but the fear and the fear over just how widespread and how blind so many are to the intersectional anti-Semitism is highlighted 1,000 times over in the Nick Cannon story. So that was a very long way of saying that I agree with you. I just want to point out to anybody who's watching, though, first, I am in a house with a lot of children. So if you hear any blood-curdling sounds in the background, we're it's just the kids.
We all understand everything's going that way nowadays. It's interesting because I've defined 4 different categories of anti-Semitism, and I divide up your intersectional as 2 different things, as left-wing, and I have a specific category as black anti-Semitism, because the complaints to me are different. The what they're saying is different. Left-wing anti-Semitism is centered on Israel, centered on anti-Zionism, centered on Jews not having any rights, Jews not being anything more than just a religion, but not being a people. And black anti-Semitism, as we're seeing, especially in this case, is Farrakhan oriented. It's the stuff he's saying, and one of the things I'd like to get into is that it's what I've learned a lot, and I've been astonished over the past few days, is that we've all heard about Farrakhan. We already know about Nation of Islam. We know about what he says about the slave trade and about whatever ridiculous things he says. But it's beyond Nation of Islam. It's like mainstream black beliefs now. If you look at the message boards and you look at the audiences that somebody like Nick Cannon gets, because he's not a Nation of Islam guy, he respects Farrakhan. But there's a lot of his fans, and he himself, they have such a deep respect for him. They're certainly not Muslims; they're not pretending to be, but they believe these conspiracy theories of Farrakhan, and you combine that with the older black tropes about Jewish landlords and Jews owning all the money and stuff like that, and you combine that, we have a really lethal, newish type of anti-Semitism that is, to me, I mean, it's already shown to be deadly, because the Jersey City shooters subscribed to that. They were, black Hebrews, but they certainly subscribed to a Farrakhan type philosophy. But and I'll tell you straight out, my biggest fear right now is with all of the random shootings that are happening in New York, and in all the boroughs of New York, and combine that sort of mentality with the random attacks of Jews that were in Brooklyn, last year or early this year. I'm very afraid that, as soon as more people are out and the randomness, I'm afraid that the Farrakhan type anti-Semitism is going to give the random people, the random shooters, a target.
Yeah, I mean, look, God forbid, and we can't predict the future, but there's no question that the first step towards anti-Semitic atrocities and hate crimes is hate speech. We know that from our historical experience that the attacks on Jews always start with the demonization of the Jewish community. And it's worth noting that there are members of the black community who have been outspoken against anti-Semitism, especially at a time like this. But I think it was Abe Foxman who put it this way in an interview with us, actually now a few years ago, that there really is a blind spot when it comes to anti-Semitism in the black community. And I think the influence and the extent to which Farrakhan is respected and appreciated in the community is, the impact is real. It's extensive, it's serious, and it is, I referred to him in a tweet recently as the most high-profile and effective, the most prominent and effective anti-Semite in America, because he just, comes across as almost Teflon. There are a lot of anti-Semites who are very quickly marginalized, and even those that have committed lesser crimes of anti-Semitism than Farrakhan. And Farrakhan is so blatant and so obvious, and really prominent in the community that he speaks for. I mean, you know, it's hard to escape the impact that he's having. And if you look at, you know, over the last number of days, you know, recent days, the scope of major figures, cultural figures, who have in some way promoted, defended, endorsed, or attended a talk of Farrakhan, it's really mind-boggling. It's really, really mind-boggling. And the only reason that Deshaun Jackson got a lot of attention for, you know, his support of Farrakhan was because he mentioned Hitler. Yes, a fake quote from Hitler, but you know, it doesn't. You know, you can't really ignore that.
Right.
But, you know, what I said on Twitter was that it's pretty clear that his interest in Hitler is a product of his sympathy with Farrakhan. That's where it started.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, if you look some of the figures, I mean, let's just go through them for a second because it really is astounding. Okay, we're talking about Deshaun Jackson, right, who has close to 1 million Twitter followers. You have P. Diddy, Snoop Dogg, Chelsea Handler, Jessica Chastain, Jamil, Ice Cube, Rick Ross, 2 Chainz, T.I. These are rappers that have millions of followers on Twitter, prominent in the Black community. Yes, there's Nick Cannon. There's Stephen Jackson, who defended Deshaun Jackson, but I believe also attended Farrakhan's speech in person on July 4th. When you combine the Twitter followings of these personalities, we're talking 73,200,000 followers.
Right.
That is an astronomical number.
Sure.
Right. And it's you know, it's a third of the country almost you're talking about here. It's a quarter of the country that's being exposed to a message that says Farrakhan is okay, or we can compartmentalize Farrakhan.
Well, the geek in me is going to say clearly a lot of the people are fans of multiple people, so it's probably a little bit less. But we're clearly talking many, many millions of people.
Right. But understand that it also there's also a ripple effect. So out of those millions of followers, some people are retweeting the message. Right. I'm not even counting that.
Sure.
Right. They're going ahead and spreading the message even further. I'm just talking about the people who have sort of firsthand exposure. You know, it's not a very technical number, but just to sort of give us the scale that we're talking about.
Absolutely. I'm afraid, again, from what we've been seeing the last few days, it's not just Farrakhan that's Teflon. It's that I think that it's because there's such sensitivity since George Floyd of offending the Black community. I think that it's blacks altogether right now that are Teflon because the whites are not going to go after it. And the number of blacks that are willing to stick their neck out, we haven't seen too many. There have been a couple. But, you know, most of them are like, oh, okay, whatever. You know, it's maybe what he said was wrong, but, you know, it's we have our own problems. It's been, and this is, so we're like in a catch-22. If the media, and this is one of the things that happened with Cannon, is that I didn't think it would be a good idea to fire him or anything like that, because the Black community would just look at it as more proof that the Jews, you know, more proof of what Farrakhan's saying is true. The Jews control everything, and they can, you know, they ruined his career, and there would be nothing learned. I suggested, and I don't know if he got the idea from me, but you know, in his non-apology, Cannon said that you know, he would have rabbis or other people, you know, he's more than willing to have them on his program. I think that he's beyond redemption. You know, the stuff he was saying was conspiracy theories that you can't argue with a conspiracy theorist. But I would hope that at least his listeners, you know, could hear another point of view, because, and again, from that, I forgot the name of the woman, Jamil Hill or something, Jamil something, I don't remember, at the Atlantic. She was saying, you know, this is really the black community grows up this way, and nobody even thinks of it as a problem. We need to at least inject some reality in the media that the Black people are consuming, that to say, you know, hey, maybe everything we're hearing that as a given is not quite true, and it would be best if it comes from within the Black community.
Yeah, I mean, look, the question of how to defeat anti-Semitism, limit anti-Semitism in any community is, you know, one that we've wrestled over and debated and you know, tried to come up with ideas and responses, for millennia. But I think, there are certainly essential pillars to it. Education, as you say, is important. Being able to sort of encounter each other, and for members of other communities to get to know Jewish people and see Jewish people and not feel threatened by Jewish people is certainly a part of it. But these are big, expansive projects if you really want to make a difference and make an impact. But certainly calling it out, and drawing a line in the sand about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable is also critical. Education is a process that takes a lot of time, and it's an important one, but it takes generation to really see the impact. But in the meantime, what we really need to see is a very sort of vociferous response, because the media is also a tool to educate the public. And I think Deshaun Jackson learned a lot in the last couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. A lot of his followers learned a lot, I'd like to think. His approach and his ultimate response, I would say, was a good one, and it was probably a product of him understanding the severity of what he'd done and what he said as a product of the international outcry. Mm-hmm. What came from someone like Nick Cannon is basically, well, I still believe what I believe, but I'm open to being convinced. I'm not going to apologize because I'm not bowing down to anyone. I mean, just real flippancy. And if he gets away with it, so to speak, if life just continues as normal, it definitely moves the line in the sand in a tragic and dangerous fashion.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is true, and maybe there is, like, again, the Deshaun thing, you're right, the Deshaun Jackson thing, maybe, made some sort of an impact. Let's hope that something can happen with the Nick Cannon. It needs the publicity first, and only just now, I mean, it's been, 2.5 days since I originally posted about it and was pushing the story. As of this evening, Forbes and TMZ finally talked about it, but it hasn't received not one wire service, not one major newspaper, not one TV network has covered the story yet, which is just, again, it's astonishing. And it just feels to me like they just don't want to touch a story about that might hurt them, that might make the black community upset. It just seems to me that Jews are being sacrificed because of
yeah, but something, let me tell you, I'm not certain that's sort of exactly what's behind it and why there's a reluctance to cover this story. I'll tell you, there's an interesting example that I like to use often when I'm sort of talking about the impact of the democratization of media for really stories that need to be heard, that are being sidelined and ignored, seeing the light of day. Mm-hmm. The impact that a site like yours can have been impossible 10 years ago or 15 years ago, because the greatest effectiveness that you can have and also that we can have is when we publish a story that gets so much attention in a democratized fashion, meaning simply that people all over social media are outraged and talking about it and sharing it. It can force a situation where it's impossible to ignore. And this one of the starkest instances of this taking place was back in 2013, when Mohamed Morsi was the president of Egypt. Remember that?
Yeah, sure.
The video that came out on January 3rd of Morsi speaking, I think 3 years earlier in 2010 about Jews and referring to them as the children of apes and pigs. You remember that?
Yeah.
Now, when we found out about the story, as I'm sure you did, incensed, and we had the story up on our site as our lead, probably within an hour or less. Now, what we saw at that time was very similar, right? here, at that time, you saw this prevailing narrative in the media that Morsi was democratically elected. The Obama administration was supportive of that process. I won't get into the details of why that wasn't exactly democracy at play, but okay, let's leave that aside. Mm-hmm. And the prevailing narrative was that Morsi was to be protected for whatever reason. Now, people obviously saw this and were outraged and incensed by it. And a couple of days later, actually 9 days later, on January 11th, 8 days later, Richard Behar, a friend of mine, fantastic journalist who writes for Forbes, an investigative journalist at Forbes. He has a great career in investigative journalism. He wrote the cover stories for Time magazine about Scientology. And he doesn't cover Middle East. He just covers corruption on Wall Street. That's kind of his beat. But he was so outraged by the story that he wrote something up on his blog in Forbes, right? You mentioned Forbes as one of the first places to write about this.
Right.
And it started to gain even more traction. People were sharing it. And on January the 15th, it had become so extensively known that the New York Times could no longer ignore it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So the story so 12 days later, 12 days mm-hmm. after the incident happened, the New York Times published the story. You go look it up online. The timestamps are exactly as I say. Mm-hmm. And the following day, the White House condemned Morsi, and then the Times ran some subsequent stories, sort of like justifying and explaining away Morsi's position, with some comments from allies from him, etc. So, despite the point that you're making, this is a long-winded way of saying that what you're saying is true, but I'm also slightly optimistic because we're living now in an era where for the first time we have the tools in our hands to ensure we as a community, as a concerned community, have the tools in our hands to ensure that our voice is heard. Mm-hmm. And the monopoly that major media outlets have on the flow of news and information is somewhat eroding. Now, certainly they still have bully pulpits and stand in very powerful positions, but there is an opportunity today, and you'll see this. You look at your numbers over the Howard, the Cannon story, right? The Nick Cannon story. Sorry, they're probably through the roof, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm talking about big numbers, 5 figures, 6 figures. I don't know what exactly, but 5 figures at least, right?
5 figures for sure.
Yeah, so and the same with us. Mm-hmm. So what does that tell us? What does that tell us? And today in the democratized environment, you can't hide.
Right.
It tells us that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people are aware of this story. Mm-hmm. They're sharing it, they're outraged by the story. And really, they're demanding that it is a story that is told and that people respond to it. First you see the Forbes, and you said ESPN, or what was the other one? Access Hollywood? TMZ. Okay, that's the start. Because those platforms are going to be shared and spoken about even more. Look, I'm willing to wager that give it a week or so, the major outlets are going to start to pick up on this if the outrage continues. But it's not something that happens on its own. It's incumbent on our readers at Algemeiner, your readers, mm-hmm. to get involved. The power that we have at our fingertips to be able to share and participate in the flow of information is also a responsibility. Mm-hmm. People have to take it seriously and take it to heart. If you see a story that's important, that people need to know about, share it, because that is what makes democracy work. It's like, if you don't vote, you cannot complain who the president is. If you don't share the Nick Cannon story on your social media networks, whatever network you have, your email list, your LinkedIn, your Facebook, your Pinterest, your Instagram, whatever it is. I don't know if anyone uses Pinterest nowadays. Yeah. Telegram. If you don't share it, you cannot complain that everybody ignores Farrakhan's anti-Semitism.
Okay, no, that is an optimistic viewpoint, and I do appreciate that, and I believe you're right. I mean, I don't think the New York Times can ignore it for forever. It's just, but you're right. It probably will take a few extra days in order for them to get there. But yeah, speaking of media, and I'm going to change topics over here, but the major story that came out today was the resignation of Barry Weiss from the New York Times. And you obviously are a newspaper person. You probably have some insights in how things happen in an op-ed environment. I will tell you what I've been hearing, and you can tell me if it sounds right to you. The New York Times op-ed page, to my understanding, has a number of editors. Each of them, traditionally, would just handle their own stories and would shepherd them through in order to be published as op-eds. When the and traditionally it's been far more anti-Israel editors than pro-Israel editors, which is the reason why, in general, the ratio over the years had been like 8-1 against Israel. After this the controversy that happened in the New York Times a few weeks ago with James Bennett and the Tom Cotton thing, they changed the policy in which now only anybody that's in the op-ed, any of the op-ed editors, can veto any of the other op-ed editors' stories. And it seems like what's happened is that all of Barry Weiss's stories since then, since she spoke out against how the Times handled the James Bennett thing, that she's just become persona non grata and she just can't get any work done. Does this sound right to you? And is it the similar way at Algemeiner, or are you hearing anything else?
Look, to be honest, I don't have any fresh insights into exact changes that were made there. We're looking into it. We have a journalist on staff who covers the Times, columnist on staff, Ira Stoll, and he's I'm waiting to hear back after he's done his investigation. So I don't have any new information right now. The one insight that I could share has a lot more to do with the business of this decision, right?
Sure.
And why not the other editors are upset with Barry. Okay, that's an ideological war, and they want to shut her down. Okay, that seems pretty obvious, and that's what she said very clearly in her statement.
Yeah.
The question is why Arthur A.G. Sulzberger not just allowed her to go, but also basically encouraged, pushed out James Bennett.
Yes.
So the question is, what is the business sense in this, right? So you might think, well, to the extent that the Times had any readers that weren't, crazy progressive nut jobs or whatever, radicals. I'm not saying all progressives are crazy nut jobs, but to the extent that the Times readers had the Times had any middle of the road reasonable readers, they're just letting go of all of them. I mean, what's going on here? Do they want to limit their audience more and more and more and more? I mean, how does that make business sense, right? So that's something that I can share some thoughts on. Basically, if you look at the New York Times business model, it's changed a lot lately, right? It used to be dependent on advertising.
Right.
The goal of advertisers is to reach as many people as possible. Someone who's selling peanut butter or shoes doesn't care if you vote Democrat or Republican. They just want to sell as much as possible, right? So when the advertising revenue was the primary source of revenue for the Times, so they were interested in more opinions. They were interested in more controversy. They were interested in more clicks, because that was good for business. They'd be able to charge advertisers more and show that they had more numbers, etc. Now the Times business model has completely changed, and it's a little bit technical. I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically, the primary source of revenue for the Times, and certainly the future revenue for the Times, is paid subscribers, specifically digital subscribers. They have about 5 million digital subscribers. And those digital subscribers, so now instead of answering to advertisers who want the biggest audience possible, they're answering to their 5 million paid subscribers, right? typically when people are going to pay for a subscription, you know, obviously there are different segments. Not everybody subscribes for the same reason. You know, it's well known in the news business. I think you also have a regular donation option. The people who give you regular donations are the people that are really passionate
Sure.
at what you're doing. They're not the people that just happen to click through on a headline and are bouncing off something else afterwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people who are paid subscribers. So the 5 million paid subscribers at a time are likely to be, in large part, the most ideologically passionate.
Mm-hmm.
All the times and cancel a subscription, they will ask you why. And the reason they ask you why is not because they're going to try and change your mind. They're taking a tally.
Mm-hmm.
How many people unsubscribed because it was too right wing, or how many unsubscribed because it was too left wing, or how many people? And obviously, the most valuable target for them are the ideologically passionate progressives. And from a business perspective, they're much more concerned about upsetting that constituency than they are about upsetting people who probably don't want to put any money into the Times bank account anyway.
Right.
So what we're going to see probably now that the money interest has aligned in a way that this sort of, you know, dogmatism, you know, harsh dogmatism, you know, is basically reinforced. You know, you're going to see, I think, a lot more of this. You know.
So no, that's a very interesting point. That's you're right. I mean, again, we mere mortals don't really look at the business model, but obviously that's how everything works. That's how cable TV and network TV and traditional newspapers and everything is based on, you know, how the money comes in. So.
Right. In short, the Times is now highly incentivized financially to eliminate differences of opinion.
Yes. And that's a shame, but you're right. That actually makes a lot of sense. So, you know, all of the high-sounding words that they like to quote from Mel Hawks and all that stuff about, you know, about diversity and everything is just those days seem to be gone.
Second to the stock price.
Yes. No, that's a very good insight. Thank you very much. You know, the last thing, just to close things out, is the Beinart. You know, has obviously been in the news. Peter Beinart for the past week for his you know, for what he wrote. Do you think that? I mean, he's always been the bad boy, you know, of Zionism. He seems to revel in it. And when he moved over to Jewish currents, this almost seemed inevitable, you know, in hindsight, because that's their bread and butter. But you know, but my fear is, you know, again, what effect does this have on the American Jewish community? You know, Israel, nobody's going to care. It's not going to affect them. Nobody's going to care about what Beinart says. But in America, you know, just like J Street was essentially created to split American Jews into, you know, pro-Israel and, I'll just say, critics of Israel, to be charitable. He seems to be wanting to split American Jews from pro-Israel into literally anti-Israel, even though he can call it a homeland, he can call it whatever he wants, but he doesn't want Israel to exist. So, you know, and do you think this is going to actually have an effect?
The short answer is no, and here's why. In terms of like measuring the impact of personalities, right? You have people that have smaller audiences, but a lot of influence, and you have people that have larger audiences, but less influence. You know, just to give an extreme example, you know, you have people who are sort of very recognizable. I don't know, like people from the Jersey Shore TV show, or Lindsay Lohan, or whatever. I mean, everybody knows who they are.
Mm-hmm.
People sort of laugh at them, you know, and mock them, and don't really take them that seriously, right? They don't really have influence. They have massive audience, but they don't have influence. Then you have other people that are more serious and have more gravitas and speak to the right people. They're not just sort of a circus act. You know, I think, you know, to be frank, that is how Peter Beinart is increasingly perceived as a circus act. Now, I think it was Jonathan Tobin had a piece in, I think it was the New York Post, where he says that the way that that Beinart was received in many in the sort of policymaking community is an indication that I didn't actually read the piece. I just saw the headline, so I don't want to mischaracterize it. Mm-hmm. But it seems to be an indication of what we might expect under Joe Biden. But from where I stand, I don't see groups like J Street, changing their position. I think the two-state solution, for reasonable left-wing Zionists, which is the bulk of the American Jewish community, doesn't seem to be in danger of being lost as the official position of the that branch of the Jewish community. I mean, look, the state of Israel was founded by left-wing Zionists, Ben Gurion and Weizmann. I mean, so a large chunk of the American Jewish community are left-wing Zionists, and this is their approach. They sort of mirror some of the differences that we saw before the founding of the Jewish state between Jabotinsky and Weizmann and Ben Gurion and others. They're really strategic. Yeah. But to drop the idea of a Jewish nation state, if Beinart coming out with a view like that, he's sort of reinforced his status as a circus act. And by the way, I would probably, again, I don't want to predict the future, but I think at some stage he's actually going to recant this position. And the reason is because the most important thing to Beinart is being the center of attention. And now he's come out with this extreme view, and everyone's talking about it. What's the next thing he can do? He could come with something even more extreme, or he can say, you know what, I changed my mind again. I'll have another op-ed. Maybe the Times will publish it. Maybe the Wall Street Journal will publish it. And everyone will talk and say, well, Beinart changed his mind. So he's really cemented his position as having, yes, a significant audience. He really does get people talking. He knows how to grab people's attention. But I just don't see the influence anywhere.
I'm not nearly as optimistic as you are as far as this is concerned. I think the next step is he'll write a book, just like he created the Crisis of Zionism book that came out of an article. He's clearly planning on doing, this is like a decade since he had that.
Yeah. He'll milk it for a while. Don't get me wrong. It's not gonna. It doesn't change tomorrow.
Jewish Currents. I mean, he went there for a reason. Jewish Currents is an extraordinarily socialist, publication. And
yeah.
I don't think that that there's any chance he's going to be moving to the right anytime soon.
Look, I don't want to get too deep into psychoanalysis over here, but I inside Peter's brain, his ideology and the importance of getting a lot of attention, I think he places that a little bit higher up. Just sort of the pattern of his behavior makes me feel that that's likely. I want to say this is really important. If you want to read something good on Beinart, mm-hmm. The Jews of Privilege in Tablet Magazine by Benji Kirstein, who's one of our editors here at Algemeiner. This is a once a year, knock it out of the park, a brilliant piece of opinion journalism. Everybody must read it. Print it out for your Shabbat table and make every one of your guests read it. He is a special and brilliant soul.
It really was excellent. And I'll throw in one other just if you care about the details of his actual article, if for somebody, because most people didn't bother fisking the article, Gilead Ini in Camera did a masterful job of going through everything he said and showing where the facts were wrong, where he contradicts himself. Really, really excellent job for the people that are like, again, the wonkish types that want to, do fact checking and that sort of thing. So, there've been a lot of good articles out of this actually, but you're right. The Kirstein articles was really fantastic. That's all I was really going to speak about. This was, and our time is pretty much up anyway. But thank you very much again, Dovid Efune. From the Algemeiner. I will show your homepage for a second so everybody can see. The editor-in-chief and the CEO as well, right? I believe.
Yeah.
So thank you
That's
very
right.
much for coming on the program. I very much appreciate your insights, and let's hope we can do this again sometime because this.
Yeah, likewise, and keep up the good work. It's a pleasure.
You too. Thank you very much. For now, I am Elder of Zion, and I will see everybody next time. Thanks a lot. Bye. Okay, we're done.